The wolf's eyes were barely open, clouded with pain and confusion, yet they held a flicker of desperate hope that no one seemed willing to see. The old farmer's boots crunched over the frost-hardened earth as he approached the shallow ditch where the small creature lay trembling, its ribs stark beneath its matted fur. Without a word, he reached down and, with a harsh grunt, nudged the wolf roughly into the shadows of the barn before turning away, his breath steaming in the cold morning air. A brittle wind swept through the skeletal branches of the trees lining the lonely dirt road, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and something else, something raw and wild that seemed out of place in this quiet corner of the world. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale, muted light over the frost-covered fields, but the warmth it promised felt distant, like a memory slipping just beyond reach. Nearby, a little girl stood at the edge of the forest, her small frame wrapped tightly in a threadbare coat, eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, a silent pleading that the world might show her kindness where it so often withheld it. She had watched the farmer's retreating figure, her heart pounding with a confusion she couldn't yet name. Why had he left the creature there? Why had he chosen abandonment over care? Her breath caught as she stepped closer to the ditch, the thin ice crackling beneath her feet. The wolf's shallow whimper cut through the stillness, fragile but insistent. She knelt down slowly, hands trembling, reaching out not just to touch but to bridge a chasm of fear and loneliness that neither of them fully understood yet. The wolf flinched, but did not pull away, as if recognizing in her the faintest glimmer of mercy. Around them, the world held its breath, trees standing silent witness, the earth frozen and unyielding, and the sky a heavy canvas waiting to spill secrets. This moment, fragile and uncertain, was the beginning of something neither the girl nor the wolf could yet grasp, but buried beneath the frost and shadow was a promise, a transformation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about fear, trust, and the strange, wild power of compassion. The little girl's name was Elsie, a name as fragile as the cracked earth beneath her boots. At 9 years old, she embodied a paradox, a child shaped by solitude yet yearning for connection. Her world was a patchwork of quiet moments and whispered secrets, stitched together by the cold breath of the countryside that stretched endlessly beyond the horizon. The farm where she lived with her grandfather was an aging relic, a stubborn holdout against the relentless march of time and neglect. Her grandfather, the old farmer who had abandoned the wolf, was a man etched with lines carved not just by years but by sorrow and regret. His name was Amos, and the land had been in their family for generations, though it had long ceased to offer abundance. Amos's hands bore the calluses of hard labor, and his eyes, once sharp as winter frost, now carried a dullness, as if perpetually clouded by memories he refused to confront. He was a man defined by routines and silence, his love expressed more through presence than words. Elsie's mother had vanished years ago, under circumstances whispered about, but never spoken aloud. The absence left a hollow ache in the farmhouse. A wound neither time nor explanation had healed. Amos, burdened by loss, had grown distant, his stern demeanor a wall erected between himself and the world, including Elsie. The girl often wandered the fields alone, her footsteps tracing paths through wild grasses and broken fences, seeking something intangible that might fill the emptiness. The frost that morning seemed to seep into every corner of their lives, a persistent chill that mirrored the emotional landscape. As Elsie knelt beside the wolf, she felt the rawness of its pain resonate within her chest. The animal's breath was shallow, each exhale a fragile thread tethering it to life. Its fur, tangled and matted, caught the pale sunlight in dull patches, revealing wounds and scars that told stories of survival and suffering. Around them, the forest breathed softly, its skeletal branches trembling in the wind like fragile fingers reaching out for warmth. The scent of damp earth mingled with the faint aroma of pine and decaying leaves, a reminder of cycles ending and beginning anew. Elsie's fingers hovered uncertainly over the wolf's trembling form, torn between fear and compassion. She remembered her mother's stories, tales of creatures misunderstood and feared, yet bound by the same need for kindness. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A small sparrow, feathers ruffled by the cold, perched on a nearby branch. Its song was tentative, a hesitant melody that seemed to echo the fragile trust growing between girl and wolf. Elsie's heart tightened with a mix of hope and dread. Could she be the one to bridge two worlds, the wild and the human, that had long been kept apart by fear and misunderstanding? As she gently wrapped her coat around the wolf, a sudden sound shattered the fragile silence, the creak of the barn door, heavy and reluctant. Amos's voice, rough and low, carried across the frost-bitten field. "Elsie, come inside. It's no place for you out here." She looked up, eyes meeting his for a brief moment, a silent exchange heavy with unspoken words. There was something in his gaze that unsettled her, a flicker of something unyielding, perhaps guilt or anger, that she could not decipher. She hesitated, torn between obedience and the instinct to protect the fragile creature at her feet. The wolf's eyes, now half closed in exhaustion, seemed to plead silently for sanctuary. Elsie's breath hitched as she weighed the uncertain safety of the barn against the bitter cold of the morning. She knew Amos's refusal to help was not born of cruelty alone, but of a deeper fear of loss, of vulnerability, of confronting wounds better left hidden. The tension between them was palpable, like the thin line of ice beneath their feet, ready to crack under the slightest pressure. Elsie's fingers tightened around the wolf's fur, grounding herself in the moment, in the shared vulnerability that bound them. She understood, in that quiet breath of time, that this was the beginning of a transformation, not just for the wolf, but for all of them. Around the edges of the farm, shadows lengthened as the sun climbed higher, casting a muted glow over fields scarred by drought and neglect. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke drifting from the chimney, mingling with the earthiness of damp soil and the faint metallic tang of frost. Inside the farmhouse, the old clock ticked steadily, marking time in a house where moments stretched and folded into one another, carrying the weight of secrets yet to be spoken. Elsie stood slowly, her small frame silhouetted against the pale light, the wolf cradled close as if protecting a fragile flame. The silence between her and Amos was charged with the promise of conflict, of truths waiting to surface in the cold light of day. Neither spoke as they moved toward the barn, but the unspoken tension hummed beneath their movements, a delicate thread woven from fear, hope, and the fragile possibility of change. In that quiet morning, beneath the frost-laden sky, a subtle shift began, a slow unraveling of old wounds and the tentative weaving of new bonds. The story unfolding was not one of sudden miracles or grand gestures, but of small, deliberate acts of courage and care that would ripple outward, challenging the boundaries between human and wild, abandonment and belonging, fear and compassion. Elsie felt the cold seep deeper into her bones as she stepped inside the barn, the wolf's fragile weight pressing against her chest. The dim interior smelled of hay, dust, and something faintly metallic, old blood or perhaps rust, but beneath it all lay a musty sweetness, like memories long buried. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence between her and Amos seemed to stretch, taut as a wire ready to snap. Amos stood by the far wall, his broad shoulders hunched as if carrying more than just the years. His eyes, shadowed beneath heavy brows, flicked toward the wolf, then away, as though afraid that looking longer might unravel something fragile within himself. Elsie noticed the slight tremor in his jaw, a subtle hesitation that betrayed the stoic mask he wore so well. It was the first crack she had seen, a fissure in the armor he'd built around his grief. Without a word, Amos turned and began shuffling through a pile of old tools, the scrape of metal against wood echoing in the stillness. Elsie's gaze lingered on his hands, scarred, rough, yet gentle as they moved with practiced care. It was a paradox she couldn't reconcile, a man so hardened by life, yet capable of such delicate gestures. She wondered what secrets lay beneath those calloused palms, what stories they could tell if only they could speak. The wolf shifted slightly, a soft whimper escaping its lips, and Elsie's fingers instinctively tightened their hold. The animal's breath was shallow, uneven, and the faint rise and fall of its chest seemed a fragile rhythm in the heavy barn air. She glanced toward Amos again, searching for a sign, a word, a glance, anything that might bridge the growing chasm between them. Instead, he met her eyes briefly, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them before he looked away. The silence resumed, heavier now, laden with things left unsaid. Elsie felt a tightening in her throat, the weight of unspoken questions pressing down like the barn's low ceiling. As she settled the wolf onto a bed of straw, a faint sound caught her attention, a scraping, soft but deliberate, coming from the corner behind a stack of crates. Elsie's heart skipped, her breath catching in the frosty air. She glanced at Amos, whose posture stiffened, his gaze narrowing toward the noise. "Probably just a rat," he muttered, voice rough, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The barn, once a place of routine labor and quiet solitude, suddenly seemed charged with an unfamiliar tension, as if shadows themselves were watching. Elsie's mind flickered back to a small detail she had noticed earlier, an old photograph pinned to the barn wall, half hidden behind a faded calendar. It showed a younger Amos, standing beside a woman with striking eyes that looked hauntingly like hers. The edges of the photo were curled and worn, suggesting it had been there for years, untouched and forgotten. Why had Amos never spoken of her? The question settled in Elsie's chest, sharp and insistent. She hadn't dared ask before, fearing the silence that always followed. But now, in the quiet of the barn, the absence felt like a presence, a ghost hovering just out of reach. As she stared at the photograph, a sudden chill swept through the barn, rustling loose straw and sending a shiver down her spine. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the cracks in the weathered wood. The wolf's ears pricked at the sound, its gaze distant, as if sensing something beyond the immediate. Amos cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "You shouldn't be here long," he said, voice low but edged with something like warning. "This place, it holds memories better left alone." Elsie bristled, the protective instinct flaring. "I'm the one who found him," she said quietly. "He needs help." Amos's eyes flashed with an emotion she couldn't name. Fear, anger, regret, before he turned away, retreating deeper into the shadows. For a moment, she thought he might say more, but the words died on his lips. The wolf's breathing grew more labored, and Elsie leaned closer, brushing a trembling hand over its matted fur. The creature's eyes fluttered open briefly, reflecting the dim light with a wild, haunted gleam. It was a look that held both surrender and defiance, a silent challenge to the coldness around it. Outside, the sky was darkening, clouds gathering as if to swallow the fading light. The farm seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Elsie felt the weight of the moment, fragile, precarious, and the unspoken promise that the night would bring revelations as unsettling as the shadows creeping through the barn. She glanced once more at Amos, his figure now almost swallowed by darkness. The man who had abandoned the wolf was a mystery wrapped in silence and scars. And somehow, in that quiet space between them, Elsie sensed that the transformation she yearned for would demand more than kindness. It would require confronting the shadows that neither of them dared face. The fragile bond between girl, wolf, and farmer was beginning to twist and strain, pulling them toward a future uncertain, where the past's secrets threatened to unravel everything they thought they knew. And in the growing twilight, the question hung unspoken. Who in the end would be transformed and how? The barn's shadows deepened as the night closed in, swallowing the last pale streaks of daylight. Elsie's breath came in shallow clouds, mingling with the cool, stale air thick with the scent of hay and earth. The wolf lay quiet now, a fragile weight against the straw, its breathing still shallow but steadier. For a moment, the silence felt almost protective, a fragile bubble suspended between the past and what was yet to come. But then, without warning, the fragile calm shattered. A sharp clatter echoed from the far corner of the barn, a sudden metallic ring, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Elsie's heart leapt, her fingers tightening instinctively around the wolf's matted fur. Amos stiffened, his broad frame turning toward the noise, eyes narrowing in the half-darkness. "Who's there?" Amos's voice was low, rough, but carried a sharp edge that cut through the stillness like a blade. No answer came, only the scrape of metal and the scuff of heavy boots against concrete. Elsie's pulse hammered in her ears as a figure emerged from the shadows, moving with a deliberate stealth that felt almost predatory. The dim light caught the outline of a man, tall, gaunt, his face obscured beneath the brim of a worn cap. Amos's jaw clenched. "What do you want here, Tom?" he demanded, the name hanging in the air like a curse. The man paused, shoulders tense but resolute. "I came to find you," he said quietly, voice rough with years of bitterness. "It's time we talked." Elsie's breath caught. The name was unfamiliar, but the weight it carried was unmistakable. Amos's eyes flickered with something dark, fear, shame, before he stepped back, his posture defensive. "This isn't your business," Amos spat, voice low but fierce. "You left. You disappeared. Don't come back here and stir up old ghosts." Tom's gaze swept past Amos and then landed on Elsie. For a brief moment, his eyes softened, a flicker of recognition sparking in their depths. "You're Elsie," he said, voice almost a whisper. "Your mother's daughter." The words struck Elsie like a blow, sharp and sudden. She swallowed hard, the fragile sense of control slipping through her fingers. "What do you mean?" she asked, voice trembling. Tom's eyes darkened with a mix of regret and anger. "You deserve to know the truth about your mother, about this place, about why she left." He stepped closer, the air between them charged with years of unsaid things. Amos hissed, "Don't listen to him. He's poison." But Tom's gaze never wavered. "I'm the one who found her, Elsie. After she ran, after she tried to escape this life." His voice cracked, raw with pain. "She was scared, of the farm, of your grandfather, of what this place does to people." Elsie's vision blurred. The stories she'd heard, fragments whispered in the quiet corners of the house, suddenly began to piece together in a way that made her chest tighten with cold. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded. "Why did you leave?" Tom's jaw tightened. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of what Amos would do. Afraid of what this farm would take from us all. Your mother wanted to protect you, but she was trapped. And when she disappeared, so did I." Amos's expression twisted with a mixture of rage and despair. "Enough," he growled. "You have no right to come back here, dragging up the past like a plague." But Elsie found herself stepping forward, the wolf forgotten for a moment. "I have a right," she said, voice steady despite the storm inside. "I have a right to know who I am, to know what happened to her." The two men's eyes locked, tension crackling like static between them. Then slowly, Amos's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. "She was my daughter too," he muttered, voice raw. "But she was broken. She tried to leave and I couldn't stop her." Tom's face softened, but the bitterness remained. "She needed help, not chains. You never understood that." Elsie felt the weight of their shared grief pressing down, heavy and suffocating. The wolf stirred beside her, its eyes flickering open, reflecting a wild, haunted light. It was as if the creature, too, carried the scars of a past tangled with loss and fear. The barn seemed to close in around them, the walls holding the echoes of old wounds and shattered hopes. Outside, the wind howled against the weathered wood, a mournful sound that matched the ache in Elsie's chest. For the first time, the story she thought she knew, the story of abandonment and survival, fractured and expanded into something far more complex. The truth was no longer a distant shadow, but a living, breathing force that demanded reckoning. Amos turned away, his voice barely a whisper. "This farm isn't just land or buildings. It's memories, pain, and sometimes it's all we have left." Tom nodded slowly, eyes on Elsie. "You have to decide what it means for you, for the wolf, for all of us." Elsie knelt beside the animal once more, feeling its fragile pulse beneath her fingertips. The transformation she had hoped for was no longer just about healing a broken creature. It was about confronting the fractures within her own family, the secrets buried beneath years of silence and fear. As the night deepened, the fragile bonds between girl, wolf, and two men who shared a fractured past began to shift, stretched taut by truths long hidden. The farm held its breath, waiting for the dawn and the reckoning it would bring. In that heavy, uncertain silence, Elsie understood that the journey ahead would ask more than courage. It would demand that she face the shadows not just outside, but within, challenging everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and the wild, fragile hope of redemption. The barn seemed to close in around them, its air thick with the scent of damp straw and cold earth, mingled now with the heavy weight of revelation. Elsie's breath hitched, shallow and uneven, as the shock of Tom's words settled deep into her bones. She knelt beside the wolf, fingers trembling as they traced the fragile rise and fall of its chest. The animal's pulse was faint but steady, a fragile thread tethering them all to a future she couldn't yet imagine. Her eyes flicked to Amos, whose broad shoulders sagged beneath the burden of broken memories. His gaze was fixed on the rough wooden floor, jaw clenched as if holding back a tide of regret. The silence stretched between them, thick and brittle, broken only by the distant howl of the wind outside, a mournful echo that seemed to carry the farm's long-forgotten sorrows. Elsie's mind reeled, fragments of stories and whispered fears colliding with the raw truth now laid bare. Her mother, once a shadowed absence in her life, was no longer a mystery, but a fractured figure of pain and escape. The image of the woman in the faded photograph haunted her, eyes so like her own, now tinged with the sorrow of a life she'd never known. A sharp ache blossomed in her chest, a mix of grief and anger, confusion swirling like a storm. She swallowed hard, trying to steady the tremble in her voice. Why didn't anyone tell me? The words slipped out, fragile and desperate. Why was I left in the dark all these years? Amos shifted, the creak of his joints sounding sudden and harsh in the quiet. It wasn't easy, he muttered, voice rough with years of silence. We all tried, in our own ways. But the explanation felt hollow, a fragile shield against the raw edges of truth. Tom's eyes softened, though the bitterness lingered. She wanted to protect you, he said quietly. But protection doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it means silence, and that silence can be a prison. Elsie's gaze dropped to the wolf again, its dark eyes flickering open briefly, reflecting a wild, haunted light. She saw in that gaze a mirror of her own fractured soul, both trapped in cages built by fear and loss. The fragile creature, once abandoned and broken, now lay at the crossroads of their shared pain. A sudden shiver ran through her, not from the cold but from the raw vulnerability exposed in that moment. Her hands clenched into fists, nails biting into her palms as a flood of questions surged beneath her skin. Who was she, really? And what place did she hold in this tangle of wounds and regrets? Amos finally looked up, eyes meeting hers with a flicker of something unspoken. Shame, fear. The lines on his face deepened, the years of unshed tears etched in shadow. I thought I was protecting everyone, he whispered, voice cracking. But maybe I was just afraid to lose what little I had left. The words hung between them, fragile as the frost that still clung to the barn's wooden beams. Elsie's heart pounded, every beat echoing the growing chasm between them. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the silence that had swallowed so much, but the weight of betrayal and sorrow made her hesitate, rooted in a mix of longing and guarded pain. Tom shifted his weight, breaking the silence with a hesitant step forward. We can't change the past, he said, voice low but steady. But maybe we can find a way through it. Together. Elsie's gaze flickered between the two men, one who raised her with quiet distance, another who carried the bitter memories of her mother's flight. The lines of loyalty, love, and resentment blurred, twisting into a complex web she wasn't ready to untangle. Trust felt fragile, like the thin ice beneath their feet, ready to crack with the slightest pressure. The wolf stirred again, a soft whimper escaping its lips. Elsie leaned closer, her breath mingling with the animal's ragged exhale. In this small, fragile life, she found a reflection of her own trembling hope, a chance to heal what had been broken. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the barn's weathered walls and sending a scatter of dry straw skittering across the floor. The dim light from a cracked window cast long shadows, painting the space in shades of grey and silence. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the fragile threads of their fractured family to either unravel or bind tighter. Elsie's thoughts tumbled, memories and doubts colliding in a restless storm. The stories she'd built to make sense of her life now felt like fragile facades, crumbling under the weight of truth. She questioned everything: her past, her future, even the quiet love she'd thought she knew. The ground beneath her shifted, leaving her unsteady but strangely alive. Her lips parted to speak, but the words faltered, caught in the tangle of emotion. Instead, she rose slowly, the wolf's fragile weight still cradled in her arms. The act was both a shield and a promise, a silent vow to protect, to understand, to face whatever lay ahead. Amos watched her, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. For a moment, the old man seemed less a figure of stern distance and more a man broken by love and regret. "We'll have to figure this out," he said quietly, voice rough but honest. "All of us." Tom nodded, the harsh lines of anger softened by a tentative hope. No more secrets, no more silence. The barn settled into a heavy quiet, the kind that follows storms, charged with the weight of what's been revealed and the uncertain promise of what might come. Elsie stood between two worlds, her heart a fragile battleground of grief and longing, fear and fierce resilience. In that suspended moment, she understood that the transformation she craved was no longer just about saving the wolf. It was about saving herself and maybe, in time, healing the fractures that had shaped them all. The night deepened outside, a velvet cloak wrapping the farm in shadow. Inside, the fragile bonds stretched taut, fragile as the first breath after a long silence, uncertain, trembling, but alive with possibility. And with that breath came a quiet truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. Elsie sat alone on the worn wooden floor of the barn, the pale moonlight filtering through the cracked window, casting long, trembling shadows across the scattered straw. The cold seeped in through the gaps in the weathered boards, curling around her like a restless whisper of the past she had only just begun to unravel. In her lap, the wolf lay still, its breathing shallow but steady, a fragile life tethered to hers by threads of hope and uncertainty. The silence around her was thick, almost suffocating, yet inside that quiet, her thoughts roared like a storm. The revelations from earlier, the fractured truths of her mother, the bitter history between Amos and Tom, played over and over in her mind, each repetition fraying the edges of her understanding, unraveling the carefully stitched fabric of her identity. She pressed her palms to the rough wood beneath her, grounding herself against the tide of emotions threatening to sweep her away. Guilt surfaced first, sharp and insistent. Why had she never questioned more? Why had the shadows of silence been allowed to stretch so long over her childhood? She thought of the faded photograph pinned to the barn wall, the younger Amos beside a woman whose eyes mirrored her own, and the ache blossomed anew. Had she been complicit in that silence, unknowingly guarding a secret that had become a cage? The sensation was suffocating, like the weight of the frost pressing against the barn's windows, cold and unyielding. Yet beneath the guilt, a fragile relief stirred. At last, the silence had been shattered. The secrets, long buried beneath years of quiet endurance, had surfaced, raw and unvarnished. It was terrifying, and yet, in some strange, aching way, liberating. The truth, messy and complicated, was no longer a distant shadow she feared to face. It was here, demanding recognition, demanding that she confront what had been hidden, not just in the world around her, but within herself. Her breath caught as memories flickered unbidden, a laughter long forgotten, the scent of wildflowers on a summer breeze, her mother's voice weaving stories that once seemed like distant dreams. Those moments, once blurred by pain and absence, now shimmered with a bittersweet clarity. She recalled the warmth of a hand brushing her hair, a fleeting touch that had seemed like a promise before it vanished. The memories felt like fragile glass, beautiful yet precarious, threatening to shatter with the slightest pressure. Elsie's gaze drifted to the wolf, its dark eyes closed in exhaustion, the rise and fall of its chest, a quiet rhythm in the stillness. In that fragile creature, she saw a reflection of herself, wounded, abandoned, yet stubbornly alive. The wolf's survival was not just a testament to its own resilience, but a mirror to her own journey. Tangled in the same web of fear, hope, and longing. The thought stirred a subtle shift within her, a tentative seed of understanding that change was both possible and necessary. The barn around her felt alive with memories. Each creak of the old wood, each whisper of wind through the cracks, seemed to echo with voices long silenced. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds wash over her, each one a thread connecting past and present. The faint rustle of straw underfoot, the distant call of an owl, the soft drip of melting frost, all became part of an unspoken conversation, a language of loss and endurance spoken in the quiet spaces between moments. Her hands trembled as they brushed over the wolf's fur, the texture rough and tangled beneath her fingers. It was a tactile reminder of the wildness that both frightened and fascinated her, a wildness she had been taught to fear, yet now found herself drawn toward. The contrast between the softness of the coat and the scars hidden beneath mirrored the contradictions within her own heart. The desire for connection tangled with the instinct to protect herself from further pain. A sudden flicker of movement caught her eye, a solitary moth, drawn to the pale moonlight filtering through the window. Its fragile wings quivered as it danced in the beam, a delicate presence caught between light and shadow. The image settled deep in Elsie's mind, a silent emblem of vulnerability and resilience entwined. Like the moth, she felt suspended in a liminal space, no longer the child sheltered by ignorance, but not yet the woman who could fully embrace the complexities of her past. The weight of the past pressed heavily on her chest, a mixture of sorrow and anger, love and loss, swirling in a tempest she could neither name nor control. She thought of Amos and Tom, two men bound by shared grief, yet divided by pain and misunderstanding. Their conflict was a reflection of the fractured legacy she had inherited, a legacy she now realized she could neither run from nor rebuild without reckoning. Her eyes drifted to the cracked mirror leaning against the barn wall, its surface fragmented and dulled by dust. She avoided meeting her own reflection, fearful of the fractured image it would reveal. Yet deep down, she knew that avoiding the mirror was only delaying an inevitable confrontation with the self she had been too afraid to see clearly. The silence between her and that broken glass was thick with unspoken truths, a quiet challenge to face the woman emerging from the shadows. Time seemed to stretch and fold, moments dissolving into one another as Elsie sat in the stillness, caught between past and future. The barn was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the world outside ceased to intrude, leaving only the raw, unfiltered landscape of her own heart. In that space, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything, the pain, the confusion, the fragile hope flickering like a candle against the dark. No answers came in the quiet, only the steady pulse of the wolf beside her, the breath of the earth beneath the barn, and the slow, deliberate unfolding of her own awakening. The journey ahead was unknown, its path shadowed and uncertain, but the seed of transformation had been planted deep within her soul. Elsie's fingers tightened briefly around the wolf's fur, a silent vow passing between them. Neither would remain as they were before, both marked by wounds, both yearning for healing. The past could not be undone, but perhaps, in the fragile space between silence and speech, in the delicate balance of fear and courage, something new might take root. The night deepened beyond the barn's walls, a vast dark canvas sprinkled with distant stars. Inside, the fragile stillness held, a quiet crucible where loss and love, fear and hope, mingled, waiting, trembling, alive. And in that suspended breath, Elsie understood that the transformation she sought was not a distant dream, but a slow, unfolding truth, born in the heart's deepest shadows and brightest longings. She was no longer the child who had found the wolf. She was becoming something else, something unspoken, uncertain, but utterly real. And with that quiet realization, the first fragile threads of a new story began to weave themselves into the night. The fragile quiet of the barn shattered like glass underfoot the moment the heavy wooden door slammed open with a violent crack. The wind, which had whispered softly only moments before, now roared through the gaps in the walls, swirling dust and loose straw into chaotic spirals. Elsie's heart leapt, the wolf stirring uneasily in her lap as she instinctively pulled it closer. shielding it from the sudden storm of sound and cold. Amos stood in the doorway, his broad frame silhouetted against the night's grim canvas. His eyes, sharp and hard, flashed with a bitterness that seemed to have been smoldering unseen beneath his weary exterior. "It's not safe here anymore," he growled, voice low but fierce, the timbre carrying both warning and accusation. "You're putting him and yourself in danger." Elsie's fingers tightened around the wolf's matted fur, her breath catching. "Danger? What danger?" Her voice cracked, a mixture of fear and defiance spilling out before she could stop it. The barn felt suddenly smaller, the walls closing in as the storm outside battered the weathered wood like a relentless drumbeat. Amos stepped inside, the door creaking ominously behind him. "There's no time," he said, voice urgent. "Tom's not the only one with eyes on this place. You don't know what you've stirred up." A cold dread seeped into Elsie's veins. The name, Tom, had already torn apart the fragile fabric of her family's past. And now Amos suggested shadows lurking even deeper, darker than she had imagined. Her mind raced, the fragments of her recent revelations colliding with this new threat. What had she awakened? What price would they all pay? Before she could respond, a sudden sharp bark echoed from outside, slicing through the tumultuous wind like a blade. The wolf's ears pricked, its body tensing beneath her hands. Elsie's gaze darted toward the open doorway, eyes wide with alarm. What was that? Amos's jaw clenched, the muscles twitching with restrained rage. "Trouble," he muttered grimly. "It's coming." The wolf whimpered softly, a haunting sound that seemed to mirror Elsie's own mounting panic. She rose unsteadily to her feet, the fragile creature still cradled against her chest. The barn's shadows stretched long and menacing, flickering with the turmoil of the storm outside, and the air felt charged, as if the very walls held their breath. In that moment, the fragile truce that had hung between them snapped. Tom's arrival, the buried secrets, the cold weight of the farm's past, all converged into a maelstrom that threatened to consume them. Elsie's resolve wavered, the ground beneath her shifting like the cracked ice she had once hesitated to cross. "Amos," she said, voice trembling but resolute, "I can't just hide him away anymore. He's not just some wild animal to be cast aside or locked away. He's alive. He's like me." Amos's eyes darkened, a flicker of pain flashing through the storm of his anger. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. This isn't just about saving a wolf. It's about surviving what this place can do to you." The tension between them thickened, the space charged with unspoken fears and old wounds. Elsie's hands trembled, the wolf shifting restlessly as if sensing the fracture widening between the two most important men in her life. She felt the weight of years pressing down, the bitter legacy of silence and betrayal twisting tighter around her heart. Suddenly, a sharp noise from the barn's far corner, a crash of falling crates jerked them all to attention. The wolf growled low, a deep rumble vibrating through its chest, and Elsie's breath hitched. Amos moved swiftly, stepping toward the noise, muscles coiled like a predator ready to strike. But before he could reach the corner, a voice cut through the darkness, harsh, mocking, and cold. Well, see, what do we have here?" The silhouette of a figure emerged, outlined by the flashes of lightning that split the sky outside. It was a man, tall and lean, his eyes glittering with a dangerous amusement. "Looks like the little girl's been busy stirring up trouble." Elsie's heart pounded in her chest, a chaotic drumbeat of fear and fury. She tightened her grip on the wolf, pressing it closer, as if her touch could shield them both from the threat now filling the barn. "Who are you?" she demanded, voice shaky but fierce. The man stepped forward, the storm's wind tugging at his coat like a dark banner. "Someone who knows what this place hides," he said, voice dripping with menace. "Someone who's been waiting for the right moment to remind you all that the past isn't done with you." Amos's face twisted with rage, but the fire behind his eyes was laced with something else. Resignation, perhaps, or fear. "Get out," he growled, "before you bring ruin on all of us." But the stranger only smiled, a cold, cruel curve that did nothing to hide the threat lurking behind it. "I'm afraid it's too late for that. You brought her here. You brought the wolf. And now you've invited the reckoning." Elsie felt the fragile threads holding her world together begin to unravel. The barn, once a refuge, now felt like a cage closing in, the storm outside echoing the turmoil within. Her mind spun, the line between friend and foe blurring, the certainty she'd clung to slipping like water through her fingers. Her voice broke as she spoke again, desperation bleeding through. "What do you want from us?" The man's gaze sharpened, piercing through the shadows. "I want what's owed. What was stolen? What must be paid?" The wolf growled louder, a low, guttural sound that shook the rafters, and Elsie's heart soared with a fierce protective instinct. She stood taller, the weight of the fragile creature grounding her, even as panic threatened to consume her. "No," she said, voice steady now, laced with a newfound steel. "We're not your debts to collect. Not anymore." The stranger's eyes flickered, surprise mingling with grudging respect. "Bold," he said, "but boldness alone won't save you." Outside, the storm intensified, thunder rolling like the drumbeat of an approaching reckoning. The barn seemed to shudder under the weight of it all, the fragile peace shattered beyond repair. Elsie glanced at Amos, then at the wolf trembling in her arms, then back at the stranger who had upended their fragile world. The path ahead was no longer hidden in shadows, it was exposed, raw and impossible to ignore. In that charged, volatile moment, everything had changed. The past was no longer a distant whisper, but a roaring storm demanding to be faced. And Elsie knew, with a certainty that burned through the fear, that the transformation she and the wolf had begun was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. The fragile bonds of family, trust and hope teetered on the edge of fracture, and the night was far from over. Something had broken loose, and whatever came next would leave no one unchanged. The stranger's words lingered in the charged air, a whisper of debts owed and shadows past. But it was the silence that followed that truly unsettled Elsie. The wolf, nestled against her chest, trembled, not from cold, but from the electric tension threading through the barn. In that moment, the fragile sanctuary she had built around this creature and herself cracked, revealing fractures deeper than any she had dared to face. As the stranger's smirk faded into the flickering shadows, Elsie's gaze drifted toward Amos. His posture, once so resolute, now seemed brittle, as if years of buried guilt and fear were unraveling before her eyes. And then, something caught her attention. The faint glimmer of a locket hanging from Amos's neck, half hidden beneath his worn shirt. It was a small, delicate thing, shaped like a wolf's paw, its surface dulled by time. She had seen it before, in the faded photograph pinned to the barn wall. The image flashed in her mind. Young Amos, standing beside the woman with those familiar eyes, the woman she now knew as her mother, her hand resting gently on that same locket. It had never been just a trinket. It was a symbol, a tether to a past soaked in love and loss, a secret shared between them in silence. Then, like a fragment of a long-forgotten melody, a memory surfaced. Elsie's mother, whispering to her as a child, telling tales of the wild heart that ran in their blood, stories of wolves not as beasts, but as kin. Those stories had sounded like fairy tales then, fragile threads woven to comfort a lonely girl. But now, cradling the wolf, Elsie saw the truth folded within those myths, hidden beneath layers of pain and fear. Her eyes flickered back to Amos, who suddenly reached a trembling hand into his pocket, drawing out a crumpled, yellowed letter. The edges were worn, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable, her mother's. "She wrote this," Amos murmured, voice cracking, "before she left, words I never had the courage to read." Elsie took the letter, her fingers brushing the fragile paper, feeling the weight of years pressing down like the frost on the farm's broken windows. As she read Bessin, the words unfolded not just a message, but a confession, a plea for understanding, an explanation for the silence that had folded around them like a shroud. "Amos," the letter began, "I am scared, not of leaving, but of what staying will do to all of us. The farm holds more than earth and stone. It carries shadows I cannot fight alone. If you read this, know that my love for Elsie is the fiercest thing I have ever known. and I trust you to protect her, even if I cannot stay." The letter's final lines trembled with a sorrow she now recognized as her own. "Forgive me for running. Forgive me for leaving you both behind." The barn seemed to close in tighter as Elsie folded the letter, her breath shallow and rapid. The stranger's face loomed in the shadows once more, but now his menace felt less clear, less absolute. His role was no longer just that of a threat, but of a catalyst, forcing truths into the light that had long been buried beneath fear and silence. Amos's eyes met Elsie's, and in that gaze she saw a man fractured by love and regret, caught between the desire to protect and the weight of his failures. "I thought I was keeping you safe," he confessed, voice barely above a whisper. "But all I did was build walls that trapped us all. Tom's presence, the stranger's menace, the wolf's fragile pulse, each thread wove tighter around her heart, binding past and present in a tapestry of complicated loyalty and unresolved pain. And yet, beneath the swirl of emotions, a darker truth took shape. The farm was not merely a place of memories and loss, but a crucible where the lives of those entwined in its soil were tested, broken, and transformed. Elsie felt the weight of her own role shift beneath her. The wolf in her arms was not simply a victim of neglect, but a mirror reflecting her own entrapment, the wildness within her, the fear she had carried like a secret burden. The stories her mother told, the locket Amos guarded, the letter she held, all converged into a revelation that she was more deeply entwined in this legacy than she had ever realized. But as the wind howled outside, rattling the barn's fragile walls, Elsie's gaze flickered to the stranger once more. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, held a glint of something unexpected, an echo of the wolf's haunted look, a reflection of the same scars they all bore. Was he merely an enemy, or was he too a prisoner of this tangled past? The fragile truce between them seemed poised on a knife's edge, allies and adversaries blurred into a complex dance of survival and secrets. Elsie's heart pounded with the realization that trust could no longer be given lightly. Every gesture, every word, carried the weight of hidden motives and unspoken fears. She tightened her hold on the wolf, feeling its pulse steady beneath her fingers, a small, stubborn heartbeat against the vast shadow of uncertainty. The creature's wildness was no longer a threat, but a lifeline, a shared resistance to the darkness creeping into their lives. In that suspended moment, the barn felt less like a cage and more like the crucible where transformation would be forged, not through destruction, but through the slow, painful unraveling of secrets and the fragile weaving of new bonds. Elsie's thoughts spiraled, her mother's absence, Amos's guarded sorrow, Tom's bitter return, and now the stranger's ominous arrival, all threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to comprehend. The path ahead was shrouded in shadow, but the light of understanding flickered, fragile yet unyielding. And as the first faint hints of dawn began to pale the night sky, Elsie realized that the true transformation was not just about healing a wounded wolf or unearthing family secrets. It was about facing the wild, tangled heart within herself and the cost that such courage demanded. The past was no longer a distant echo but an urgent presence, demanding not only reckoning but a choice. Who would she become in this unfolding reckoning? Protector, avenger, healer, or something altogether new, shaped by the wildness she had once feared, and the fierce hope she now carried like a flame in the dark? The wolf stirred, eyes opening to meet hers with a quiet understanding. In that gaze, Elsie found a promise. That transformation, though fraught with pain and uncertainty, was possible, but only if she dared to step fully into the shadows and embrace the wildness within. The barn had fallen into a heavy silence, the kind that presses against the skin and refuses to let go. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world slick and cold under a sky smeared with grey dawn. Inside, Elsie sat alone, Rika, the wolf's fragile body curled against her chest. The warmth she offered felt like a fragile island amid the vast sea of uncertainty that now stretched beyond the weathered barn walls. Her hands trembled as they traced the ragged edges of the letter she'd read the night before, the words still echoing in her mind. "Forgive me for running. Forgive me for leaving you both behind." Forgiveness. It was a word that tasted bitter on her tongue, tangled with grief and anger. How could she forgive when everything she thought she knew had been shattered? When the people she depended on had become strangers bound by silence and secrets? A sudden creak echoed through the barn, sharp and brittle, fracturing the fragile cocoon she'd wrapped around herself. Elsie's breath caught, and she tightened her hold on the wolf, feeling its heartbeat flutter beneath her fingers, a small, stubborn reminder that life persisted even in the darkest places. She stood slowly, the weight of the wolf anchoring her to the earth, but her legs felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath them had given way. The barn's dim light flickered from a single candle Amos had left burning on a nearby crate, casting long shadows that danced and twisted like ghosts. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp straw and cold metal, the residue of battles fought in silence. Elsie's gaze drifted toward the cracked mirror leaning against the far wall, its surface fractured, shards of reflection catching the candlelight in jagged slivers. She saw herself, fragmented, uncertain, raw. The girl who had found the wolf was gone, replaced by someone unmoored, standing at the edge of everything she had ever known. Her fingers brushed the mirror's surface, cold and rough beneath her skin. The reflection wavered, distorted, not just by the cracks but by the weight of the truth she carried. Who am I, if not the sum of these broken pieces? The question echoed in the hollow spaces of her mind, unanswerable yet relentless. A low growl stirred in the wolf's throat, pulling Elsie from her thoughts. The animal's eyes fluttered open, meeting hers with a wild, haunted gaze. In that moment, the fragile bond between them felt both a lifeline and a chain. They were tethered by wounds too deep to hide, by fears too raw to speak aloud. The barn door creaked again, tentative and hesitant. Elsie's heart thundered in her chest as Amos stepped inside, his figure a silhouette against the creeping light. His eyes, once so inscrutable, now held a flicker of something she couldn't name. Regret. Resignation. The distance between them felt wider than ever, a canyon carved by years of silence. "We can't keep hiding," Elsie whispered, voice barely more than a breath. "Not from each other, not from what's coming." Amos's jaw tightened, the lines of his face hardening. This place, it's not just a farm, it's a wound. And some wounds don't heal. The words hung between them, heavy and final. Elsie felt the fragile threads of their connection fray, unraveling beneath the weight of unspoken truths. She realized then that the man who had raised her, the man who had abandoned the wolf, was as trapped by the past as she was. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back, unwilling to give the storm permission to break free. Instead, she stepped back, the wolf shifting restlessly in her arms. The creature's ragged breath was a fragile echo of her own, a shared rhythm of survival and despair. "I don't want to lose you," she said, voice breaking. "But I can't stay here, not like this." Amos's gaze faltered, vulnerability flickering beneath his stoic mask. "Then what do you want, Elsie? To burn it all down? To walk away from everything that's left?" Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms until the pain grounded her. "I want to fight, to find a way through this, but not by pretending it isn't broken." The silence that followed was thick, a chasm wider than words could bridge. Outside, the first tentative light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the barn walls, pale and uncertain. It illuminated the mess of straw and tools scattered across the floor, a reflection of the chaos now spilling into their lives. Elsie sank to the ground, the wolf settling beside her, its warmth a fragile comfort against the cold. The weight of the past pressed down like the frost still clinging stubbornly to the farm's broken windows. She thought of Tom, the stranger who carried both bitterness and truth, and of the dangerous line he'd crossed by returning. Her breath caught as she whispered into the quiet, "There's no going back." The words settled over her like a shroud, a declaration of a new reality forged in the crucible of loss and revelation. She was no longer the child hidden at the edge of the forest, no longer the silent witness to secrets better left buried. The path before her was dark and uncertain, but it was the only path left to walk. In the stillness, a sudden snap of a twig outside pulled her attention to the threshold of the barn. The wolf's ears pricked, muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. Elsie's heart pounded, a fierce protective instinct surging through her veins. She rose, steadying herself against the rough wood of the wall. The storm inside her had reached a breaking point, a fracture in the foundation of everything she'd believed. She could no longer stand on the edges of fear and hope. The moment had come to step through the darkness, to face whatever waited beyond. Her voice was steady, quiet, but resolute. "I'm ready." The wolf's eyes met hers, wild and unwavering, a mirror of the courage kindling inside her. Together, they stood at the brink, two fragile souls bound by wounds and wildness, poised to walk into the shadows and whatever reckoning awaited. The barn seemed to hold its breath, the fragile peace shattered, but a new, raw clarity taking its place. Elsie had crossed the line, from uncertainty to resolve, from silence to action. The transformation she had begun was no longer a distant hope, but an urgent necessity. Outside, the world stirred awake, the first birdsong tentative against the fading night. Inside, the fragile bonds that had tethered them to the past loosened, making way for a new, uncertain beginning. And in that quiet dawn, Elsie understood that the story was no longer about what had been lost, but about what she was willing to fight for, even if it meant losing everything she had left. Elsie stood in the dim barn light, the wolf's steady heartbeat pressing against her palm like a fragile promise. The dawn's pale glow seeped through the cracked window, casting long, fractured shadows across the worn floorboards, fractures like those unraveling within her. The silence was no longer a sanctuary but a weight, pressing down with urgency, demanding a reckoning she could no longer evade. Her breath hitched as she faced Amos, the man whose silence had shaped her childhood, whose guarded sorrow had built walls she now realized she had to tear down. "I can't keep living in the shadows of what was," she said, voice trembling but resolute. "I need to know everything, no more half-truths, no more secrets." Amos's eyes flickered, a storm of regret and reluctance swirling within their depths. "Some truths," he whispered, "are like fire. Once lit, they burn everything around them." But beneath the caution, there was a hint of surrender, a crack in the armor he'd worn for so long. Elsie swallowed the knot of fear tightening her throat. The choice was clear. Even if the path was jagged and uncertain, she would confront the past head-on, even if it meant fracturing the fragile bond still holding them together. "I'm ready to face the fire," she said, "because if I don't, I'll never know who I really am, or what I'm fighting for." The wolf shifted in her arms, a soft whimper vibrating through the silence, as if echoing the fierce determination swelling inside her. She felt the wildness within that creature mirror her own, a shared defiance against the cage of fear and abandonment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn's weathered walls, carrying with it the scent of rain and earth, the promise of cleansing, or perhaps destruction. The storm brewing beyond the horizon was not just in the sky, it was in the heart of the farm, in the fractured family standing at the edge of collapse. Amos's voice broke the tense quiet. "If you're going to do this, you need to understand what you're stepping into. There are people, things that won't let the past stay buried. They'll come for you, for the wolf, for all of us." Elsie's gaze hardened. "I know, and I'm not afraid." The words surprised even her, carrying a weight forged from months of silence, pain, and small, hard-won hope. "I'm done running. From the truth, from my family, from myself." The barn door creaked as it swung open slowly, letting in a rush of cold air that stirred the loose straw at their feet. The threshold felt symbolic, a boundary crossed, a door opening onto the uncertain path ahead. Elsie stepped forward, wolf still cradled close, each movement a declaration of agency, of refusal to be a passive witness to her own story. Behind her, Amos hesitated, the lines on his face deepening with the burden of choices made and unmade. "Then we keep each other safe," he said quietly, "because whatever comes next, we face it together." A shadow flickered at the barn's edge, a figure watching, waiting. The fragile peace shattered anew. Elsie's heart pounded, a fierce drumbeat echoing the wild pulse of the wolf. The consequences of her decision rippled outward already, tightening the noose of danger and revelation. Her voice, steady and sharp in the charged air, cut through the rising storm. No more silence, no more hiding. This ends now. The wolf's eyes met hers, wild, unyielding, a mirror of the fierce resolve blazing within. The past was no longer a chain, but a crucible, and Elsie had stepped fully into the fire. Beyond the barn's broken walls, the world shifted, shadows lengthening and converging toward an inevitable collision. Nothing could stop what was coming next. The barn seemed to inhale the darkness, folding the gathering shadows into its worn beams and cracked floorboards. Elsie stood motionless, the wolf's labored breath a faint rhythm against her chest, a fragile tether to a world that felt as if it were unraveling by the second. The air was thick, dense with things left unsaid, with the weight of choices made and consequences looming just beyond the brittle veil of night. Outside, the wind had stilled, as if nature itself held its breath, waiting. Amos lingered near the doorway, his silhouette a heavy shadow pressed against the dim light bleeding from the cracked window. His eyes were narrowed, not in anger, but in a hard, tight silence that spoke volumes. They darted toward Elsie, then away, as if afraid that even a glance might shatter the fragile calm. The space between them pulsed with tension, an electric current running beneath the surface of their silence. Neither moved, but the quiet was suffocating, each second stretching like a taut wire ready to snap. Elsie's heart hammered in her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that no amount of steadying breaths could quiet. The storm of emotions inside her collided, fear mingling with defiance, dread laced with a flicker of fierce hope. She wanted to speak, to break the suffocating silence, but the words lodged in her throat, heavy as stones. Instead, she swallowed hard, her gaze flickering to the wolf, its eyes half-closed yet flickering with a wild, haunted light that mirrored her own unrest. The barn creaked faintly, a loose board shifting in the unseen draft, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the charged stillness. Amos's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, but stopped short, the space between them remaining unbridged. His voice, when it came, was low, roughened by years of restraint. "This isn't a place for hope," he said, the words barely more than a whisper. "Not anymore." Elsie's eyes burned with unshed tears, a fragile flame flickering against the encroaching dark. "It has to be," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "It's the only thing left." Between them, the wolf shifted, a soft whimper escaping its lips, as if echoing the unspoken plea hanging in the air. The moment stretched, dense and heavy, as if the barn itself was a cage tightening around them all. Outside, the first star blinked faintly in the vast ink-black sky, cold and distant, a tiny beacon in a world teetering on the edge of collapse. The silence deepened, swallowing every breath, every heartbeat, until time itself seemed to slow. Elsie's eyes darted to the cracked mirror leaning against the wall, its fragmented surface catching the dim light in jagged shards. The reflection showed a girl unmade and remade, caught between fear and courage, between the past's shadows and a future shrouded in uncertainty. Amos's gaze flickered back to the wolf, then to Elsie, and for a fleeting second, the stoic mask cracked, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. But just as quickly, it hardened again, a wall rising where openness had briefly flickered. The distance reasserted itself, a gulf widening with every silent second. A faint noise stirred from the barn's corner, soft, deliberate, a reminder that the night was not empty, that unseen eyes and waiting threats lurked just beyond the fragile sanctuary they had built. Elsie's fingers tightened around the wolf's fur, grounding herself in the small, fierce life she held. "We can't run from this," she breathed, the words heavy with resolve and dread. "Whatever's coming." "It won't wait." Amos said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes, a reluctant acknowledgement, a warning wrapped in grief. The tension coiled tighter, the air charged with the unspoken knowledge that the fragile peace was a breath away from shattering. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling loose boards and stirring the shadows into restless movement. The barn shuddered, a small tremor against the vast stillness, as if the earth itself was bracing for impact. In that suspended moment, with the wolf's heartbeat pulsing beneath her palm and the weight of the past pressing down, Elsie stood poised on the edge, between fear and fury, between surrender and fight. The silence screamed louder than any word, a final tightening of the knot before the storm broke loose, and all that remained was waiting for the inevitable. The barn seemed to collapse inward, as if the very walls were closing in to witness what could no longer be contained. Elsie's breath hitched, ragged and uneven, each inhale a desperate gasp, as the storm inside her shattered all pretense of calm. The wolf in her arms whimpered, a fragile echo of her own breaking heart, its wild eyes locked on hers with a silent plea that tore at her soul. Amos's voice came, brittle and raw, cutting through the suffocating silence like a blade. "You don't know what you're doing, Elsie. You never have." Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she clutched the wolf tighter, the creature's pulse thundering beneath her palm, a wild, stubborn heartbeat tethered to hers. "Then tell me," she demanded, voice cracking. "Tell me what I don't know. Tell me the truth." For a long moment, Amos said nothing. His eyes, once hard as stone, flickered with something unrecognizable. Pain, regret, fear, all bleeding through the cracks in his armor. Then, with a shuddering breath, he stepped forward, the weight of years pressing down on his bowed shoulders. The truth. His laugh was bitter, a sound ripped from the depths of despair. "You've been living a lie from the moment you were born." Elsie's chest tightened, panic threatening to claw its way out. "What lie? What are you talking about?" Amos's gaze fell to the worn locket around his neck, the wolf's paw glinting faintly in the dim light. "That wolf you hold, it's not just some stray. It's part of you, part of what your mother tried to protect you from." Her fingers faltered, the wolf's weight suddenly heavier, as if the air around them thickened with unspeakable truths. "What do you mean?" Her voice was barely a whisper. He swallowed hard, voice breaking. "Your mother, she carried a secret, a curse, some called it. A wild bloodline that runs through our family, wolves not just in spirit but in flesh. You're not just her daughter, Elsie. You are of that wildness too. The wolf isn't just a creature you saved. It's a part of yourself you've been running from." The words slammed into her like a thunderclap. Her world fractured, the fragile identity she had clung to splintering into shards too sharp to gather. Tears burned her eyes as the truth she'd denied roared through her veins, raw and undeniable. "No," she gasped, shaking her head. "That can't be. I'm just me, a girl, not some monster." Amos's expression cracked open, revealing a grief so vast it threatened to swallow them both. "You're not a monster, Elsie. You're a survivor, but the farm, this place, it tried to bury that part of you, to keep you safe by keeping you chained. Your mother knew what it meant to be different. She ran to save you from it. But you can't hide forever." The wolf stirred, nuzzling her cheek, its wild eyes shimmering with fierce understanding. And in that moment, Elsie felt the impossible truth settle deep, a wildfire igniting within her chest, a fierce, untamable force that had always been there, waiting. Her body trembled violently, the walls of the barn echoing with the sound of her sobs, raw and unfiltered. She dropped the locket Amos offered, its delicate chain breaking with a sharp snap against the floor, scattering the pieces like broken promises. "I don't want this," she cried, voice shattering. "I don't want to be this thing." Amos reached for her, but she pulled away, stumbling back, tears streaming down her face. "You never told me. You left me to figure it out alone. How could you?" His own tears spilled over, his voice a broken whisper. "I was scared for you, for all of us. I thought silence would save you." "No," Elsie shook her head, voice fierce now. "Silence nearly destroyed me. But I won't be silent anymore. I won't run." The wolf's growl rose, low and protective, a wild anthem rising from the depths of their shared pain. Elsie stood, trembling but resolute, the shattered pieces of her past scattered at her feet, the fragile illusion of normalcy forever broken. She was no longer just a little girl who found a weak wolf in the cold. She was something new, a collision of human and wild, fear and strength, loss and fierce hope. And as the first light of dawn crept through the broken barn windows, Elsie knew this was the moment everything changed. There was no going back. The past was shattered. The future was raw and wild, and hers to claim. The morning broke with a muted light, soft as a whispered apology, filtering through the cracks in the barn's weathered boards. Elsie sat on the cold floor amid scattered straw, the wolf resting quietly beside her, its breath steady now, no longer a fragile thread, but a steady pulse, a heartbeat that had weathered storms both outside and within. The silence around them didn't feel empty or oppressive. It felt like something earned, a fragile space carved out after chaos, where wounds could breathe and time could stretch just enough to begin healing. She traced her fingers over the locket now repaired and worn around her neck. Its wolf's paw emblem transformed from a symbol of fear into one of belonging. That small talisman, once a secret tether to a past she had resisted, now felt like a bridge, the connection between what was lost and what could still be found. She thought back to the frostbitten morning when she first found the wolf, so weak and broken, and herself just as fragile, trembling between fear and hope. The wolf's eyes then held a desperate flicker. Now they held something quieter, trust, resilience, and a shared understanding born of survival. Elsie's gaze lifted to the cracked mirror leaning against the barn wall, its fractured surface no longer a reflection of shattered identity, but a mosaic of strength woven from broken pieces. The girl who had hidden behind silence and shadows was still there, but she had changed. She was now someone who faced the wildness within and without, who had learned that transformation was not about erasing scars, but embracing them as maps of where she had been and where she might yet go. The farm outside was waking slowly, the wind softening, the trees no longer skeletal but stirring with tentative new growth. It was a reminder that endings are seldom neat. They are often messy, uncertain, and threaded with both loss and possibility. Amos's absence in the moment was felt deeply but without bitterness. He was part of the story now, a complicated figure etched with regret and love, whose silence no longer held dominion over her. And the wolf, the weak creature once abandoned, had become a mirror, a companion, a wild part of her own story that refused to be silenced. Elsie rose, the wolf moving with her, their steps slow and deliberate across the frost-hardened earth outside. She paused at the edge of the forest, the same place where her journey had begun, the air carrying that faint scent of wood smoke and something wild, no longer out of place, but a part of the world she inhabited. The wind caught her hair, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't shrink from it. Instead, she breathed it in deeply, a silent promise to herself and to the creature beside her, to keep moving forward, to hold on to hope even when it felt fragile, and to never forget the power of mercy that had bridged the chasm between fear and belonging. Her voice broke the silence, low and steady. We survived the cold. Now shall we find our own way? The wolf's eyes met hers, fierce and unyielding, and in that moment the story wasn't about endings or beginnings, but about the slow, wild unfolding of becoming, of learning to live with the parts of ourselves we once tried to hide. If this story touched something in you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Elsie's place? If you found meaning in her journey, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that explore the wild, fragile heart of human experience. Thank you for walking this path with us.